Alright guys, chapter 17, The Painted Bird. In the late afternoon, crowds of peasants came from the villages. They brought fruit and vegetables in exchange for the rich canned pork sent to the Red Army all the way from America, for shoes or for a piece of tent canvas suitable for making a pair of trousers or a jacket. As the soldiers were finishing their afternoon duties, one heard accordion music and singing here and there. The peasants listened intently to the songs, barely understanding the words. We are going to fight the bankers, the landlords, and the rest. We'll seal the doom of kulaks, these damn blood-sucking pests. We Red Army soldiers are fighting for the poor, to give the people freedom and make their lives secure. Some of the peasants joined boldly and loudly in the song. Others appeared alarmed, suspiciously watching the faces of their neighbors who displayed such sudden and unexpected affection for the Red Army. Women came from the villages in increasing numbers, together with their men. Some of them flirted openly with the soldiers, trying to lure them in the direction of their husbands or brothers who were trading a few steps away. Ashen-haired and light-eyed, they pulled down their ragged blouses and hiked up their worn skirts with casual air, swinging their hips as they strolled around. The soldiers came closer, bringing from their tents bright cans of American pork and beef, packets of tobacco, and paper for rolling cigarettes. Disregarding the presence of the men, they looked deep into the women's eyes, accidentally brushing against their buxom bodies and breathing in their odor. Soldiers occasionally sneaked out of the camp and visited the villages to continue trade with the farmers and meet village girls. The command of the regiment did its best to prevent such planned secret contacts with the population. The political officers, the battalion commanders, and even the divisional news sheets warned the soldiers against such individual escapades. They pointed out that some of the wealthier farmers were under the influence of the nationalist partisans who roamed the forests in an attempt to slow down the victorious march of the Soviet army and to prevent the approaching triumph of a government of workers and peasants. They indicated that men from other regiments returned from such excursions severely beaten and that some had disappeared altogether. One day, however, a few soldiers disregarded the risk of punishment and managed to slip out of the camp. The guards pretended not to notice. Life in the camp was monotonous, and the soldiers waiting for departure or action were desperate for some entertainment. Mika the cuckoo knew about this outing of his friends, and he might even have gone with them if he had not been crippled. He often said that since the Red Army soldiers risked their lives for these local people by fighting the fascists, there was no reason to avoid their company. Mika had been looking after me ever since I entered the regimental hospital. Thanks to his feeding, I gained weight. Mika fished out of the great cauldron the best pieces of meat and skimmed the fat off the soup for me. He also assisted at my painful injections, boosting my courage before medical examinations. Once when I got indigestion from overeating, Mika sat with me for 2 days, holding my head when I vomited and wiping my face with a wet cloth. While Gavrila taught me serious things, explaining the role of the party, Mika introduced me to poetry and sang me songs, strumming an accompaniment on his guitar. It was Mika who took me to the regimental cinema and explained some of the scenes. I went with him to watch the mechanics repairing the engines of the powerful Zis and Studebaker trucks, and it was Mika who took me to see the sharpshooters in training. Mika was one of the best liked and respected men in the regiment. He had a fine military record. On special army days, one could see decorations on his faded uniform, which would be the envy of regimental or even divisional commanders. Mika was a hero of the Soviet Union, the highest military honor, and was one of the most decorated men in the whole division. He was also a party candidate. His feats as a sharpshooter were described in newspapers and books for children and adults. He was featured several times in newsreels seen by millions of Soviet citizens on collective farms and in factories. The regiment took great pride in Mika. He was photographed for the divisional news sheets and interviewed by correspondents. Soldiers often told tales at the evening campfire about the dangerous missions he had undertaken only a year earlier. They discussed endlessly his heroic actions alone in the rear of the enemy, where he parachuted in and then sniped at officers and couriers of the German army with extraordinary long-range marksmanship. They marveled at the way Mika managed to return from the front lines only to be sent out again on another dangerous mission. During such talks, I swelled with pride. I sat next to Mika, leaning on his strong arm, listening intently to his voice so as not to miss a word of what he was saying or the questions of others. If the war lasted until I was old enough to serve, perhaps I too could become a sharpshooter, a hero about whom working people talked at their meals. Mika's rifle was the object of constant admiration. Yielding to requests, he would take it out of its sheath, blowing off invisible specks of dust on the sights and stock. Trembling with curiosity, young soldiers bent over the rifle with the reverence of a priest at the altar. Old soldiers with large horny hands picked up the weapon with its softly polished stock, as a mother picks up a baby from its cradle. Holding their breath, they examined the crystal clear lenses of the telescopic sight. It was through this eye that Micah saw the enemy. It was these lenses that brought the victim so close to him that he could see their faces, gestures, smiles. It helped him to aim unerringly at the spot beneath the metal bars where the German heart was beating. Micah's face darkened as the soldiers admired his rifle. He instinctively touched the pained, stiffened side of his body in which the fragments of a German bullet were still embedded. That bullet had ended his career as sniper a year ago. It tormented him daily. It changed him from Micah the cuckoo, as he had been known before, into Micah the master, as he was now called. He was still the regimental sharpshooting instructor, and he taught young soldiers his art, but that was not what his nature craved. At night I sometimes saw his wide-open, bright-piercing eyes staring at the triangular roof of the tent. He was probably reliving those days and nights when, hidden in branches or in ruins, far behind enemy lines, he waited for the right moment to pick off an officer, a staff messenger, an airman, or a tank driver. How many times he must have looked the enemy in the face, followed their movements, measuring the distance, setting his sights once more. With each one of his well-aimed bullets, he strengthened the Soviet Union by removing one of the enemy officers. His name is Micah the Cuckoo. Special German squads, excuse me guys, there's a little fly right here. Special German squads with trained dogs had searched for his hiding places, and the manhunts had covered wide circles. How many times he must have thought he would never return, yet I knew that these must have been the happiest days of Mitka's life. Micah would not trade these days when he was both judge and executioner for any others. Alone, guided by the telescopic sights of his rifle, he deprived the enemy of their choicest men. He recognized them by their decorations, by the insignia of their rank, by the color of their uniforms. Before pulling the trigger, he must have asked himself if this man was worthy of death by a bullet from Micah the Cuckoo's rifle. Perhaps he should wait for a choicer victim, a captain instead of a lieutenant, a major instead of a captain, a pilot instead of a tank gunner, a staff officer instead of a battalion commander. Every one of his shots could bring death not only to the enemy but also to himself, thus robbing the Red Army of one of its finest soldiers. Thinking about it all, I admired Micah more and more. Here, lying on a bed a few feet from me, was a man who worked for a better and safer world, not praying at church altars but by excelling in his aim. The German officer in the magnificent black uniform who spent his time killing helpless prisoners or deciding the fate of small black fleas like me now appeared pitifully insignificant in comparison with Micah. When the soldiers who had slipped out of the camp to the village did not return, Micah became worried. The hour of the night inspection was approaching, and their absence might be discovered at any moment. We were sitting in the tent. Micah paced nervously, rubbing his hands moist with emotion. They were his closest friends, Grisha, a good singer, who Micah accompanied on his accordion, Lanka, who came from the same city, Anton, a poet who could recite better than anyone else, and Wanka, who Micah claimed had once saved his life. The sun had set and the guard had been changed. Micah kept looking at the phosphorescent dial of his watch, which he had won as war loot. There was a commotion among the guards outside. Someone shouted for a doctor as a motorcycle sputtered at top speed across the camp toward headquarters. Micah rushed out, pulling me along with him. Others also came running behind. Many soldiers were already assembled at the guard line, surrounding four motionless bodies. Several soldiers covered with blood knelt or stood. We learned from their incoherent words that they had attended a feast at a nearby village and had been attacked by some drunken peasants who had become jealous of their women. The peasants had outnumbered and disarmed them. 4 of the soldiers had been killed with axes and others badly wounded. The deputy commander of the regiment arrived, followed by other senior officers. The soldiers made way for them and stood at attention. The wounded men tried in vain to rise. The deputy commander, pale but composed, listened to the report of one of the injured men and then issued his orders. The wounded were immediately taken to the hospital. Some of them walked slowly, supporting one another and wiping blood from their faces and from their hair with their sleeves. Micah crouched at the feet of the dead men, staring silently at their rigid, butchered faces. Other soldiers stood by, breathing heavily. Wanka lay on his back, his white face turned to the surrounding onlookers. In the dim light of a lantern, one could see streaks of congealed blood on his chest. Lanka's face had been split in two by a terrible blow from an axe. Splintered skull bones were mixed with hanging ribbons of neck muscles. The battered, bloated faces of the other 2 were barely recognizable. An ambulance drove up. Mika nervously clutched my arm while the bodies were taken away. The tragedy was brought up in the evening report. The men swallowed hard, listening to new orders forbidding any contact with the hostile local population and prohibiting any action which could further aggravate its relations with the army. That night, Mika kept whispering and muttering to himself, beat his head with his fist, and then sat in brooding silence. Several days passed. Regimental life was returning to normal. The men mentioned the names of the dead less frequently. They began to sing again and prepared for the visit of a field theater, but Mika was not well, and someone else replaced him in his training duties. One night, Mika woke me up before dawn. He told me to dress quickly and said no more. When I was ready, I helped him to bind his feet and pull on his boots. He groaned with pain, but moved in haste. When he was dressed, he made sure the other men were still asleep and then pulled out his rifle from behind the bed. He took the weapon out of its brown case and slung it over his shoulder. He carefully replaced the empty case behind the bed, locking it to look as though the rifle was still inside. Then he uncovered the telescope and slipped it into his pocket together with a small tripod. He checked his cartridge belt and took a pair of field glasses off the hook and looped the strap around my neck. We silently slipped out of the tent past the field kitchen. When the men on guard had marched by, we ran quickly for the bushes, crossed the adjoining field, and were soon outside the encampment. The horizon was still swathed in nocturnal mist. The white streak of a country lane crept between the dim layers of fog which hung over the fields. Mika wiped the perspiration off his neck, hitched his belt, and patted me on the head as we hurried toward the woods barely visible in the distance. I did not know where we were going or why, but I guessed that Mika was doing something on his own, something he was not supposed to do, something that might cost him his position in the army and in public esteem. There's a beautiful hog right there. Looks like it has like a bluish beak, at least in the shade, like a light bluish beak. A hog with a light bluish beak. I gotta look that up. We walked fast. Mika was obviously tired as he limped and pulled up his rifle, which kept slipping off his shoulder. Whenever he stumbled, he muttered curses, which he usually forbade other soldiers to use. And realizing I had heard them, ordered me to forget them at once. I nodded in agreement, though I would have given much to have my speech back so that I could repeat these magnificent Russian curses, which were as juicy as ripe plums. We cautiously bypassed the sleeping village. No smoke rose from the chimneys. The dogs and the roosters were silent. Mika's face stiffened and his lips became dry. He opened a flask of cold coffee, took a gulp, and gave me the rest. We hurried on. So the boy's still deaf. The boy's still, he can't speak. He's mute. He's still mute. I wonder how he became mute. I can't remember. I think when he was getting beat up or something, or choked or something happened like that. I can't remember. Honestly, I'm reading so many books at the same time, so... It was daylight by the time we entered the forest, but the woods were still gloomy. The trees stood stiffly like sinister monks in black habits, guarding the glades and clearings with the broad sleeves of their branches. At one point, the sun found a tiny opening at the top of the trees, and the rays shone through the open palms of chestnut leaves. After some reflection, Mika selected a tall, sturdy tree close to the fields on the edge of the forest. The trunk was slippery, but there were knots, and broad boughs grew fairly low. Mika first helped me on to one of the bows and then handed me the long rifle, the binoculars, the telescope, and the tripod, all of which I hung delicately on the branches. Then it was my turn to help him up. When Mika, groaning and puffing and wet with sweat, reached me on the branch, I climbed to the next one. Thus helping each other, we managed to get almost to the top of the tree with the rifle and all the equipment. After a moment's rest, Mika deftly bent back some branches which obscured our view, cut some of them and tied others. We soon had a reasonably comfortable and well-concealed seat. Unseen birds fluttered in the tops of the adjoining trees. Growing accustomed to the height, I discerned the outlines of buildings in the village just ahead of us. The first puffs of smoke were beginning to rise into the sky. Mika attached the telescope to his rifle and fixed the tripod firmly. He sat back and carefully placed the rifle on its support. He spent a long time scanning the village through the binoculars, then he handed them to me and began to adjust the telescope sight of the rifle. Through the binoculars, I surveyed the village, their image amazingly enlarged. The houses seemed to be just in front of the forest. The picture was so sharp and clear that I could almost count the straws in the thatched roofs. I could see hens pecking in the yards and a dog in the thin sunshine of the early morning. Mika asked me for the binoculars. Before handing them back, I had another quick glimpse of the village. I saw a tall man leaving a house. He stretched his arms, yawned, and looked at the cloudless sky. I could see that his shirt was wide open in the front, and there were big patches on the knees of his pants. Mika took the binoculars and placed them beyond my reach. Motionlessly, he studied the scene through his telescope. I strained my eyes, but without the glasses could see only the dwarfed houses far below. A shot rang out. I jumped and birds fluttered in the foliage. Mika raised his red, perspiring face and muttered something. I reached for the binoculars. He smiled apologetically and held back my hand. I resented Mika's refusal but could guess what had happened. In my imagination, I saw the farmer keeling over, reaching above his head with his hands as if seeking support from an invisible handhold as he slumped on the threshold of his house. Mika reloaded the rifle, placing the empty cartridge case in his pocket. He calmly inspected the village through the binoculars, whistling softly through tight lips. I tried to visualize what he saw there, an old woman wrapped in brown rags walking out of the house, looking at the sky, crossing herself, and at the same moment catching sight of the man's body lying on the ground. As she approached it with clumsily waddling steps and bent down to turn his face toward her, she noticed the blood and ran screaming toward the neighboring houses. Startled by her cries, men pulling on their trousers and women only half awake started running out of the houses. The villages soon swarmed with people rushing to and fro. The men bent over the body, gesturing wildly and looking helplessly in all directions. Mika moved slightly. He had his eyes glued to the telescopic sight and was pressing the butt of his rifle to his shoulder. Drops of perspiration glistened on his forehead. One of them broke away, rolled into his bushy eyebrows, emerged at the base of his nose, and started along the diagonal ridge of his cheek on its way to his chin. Before it reached his lips, Mika fired 3 times in quick succession. I closed my eyes and saw the village again with the 3 bodies sliding to the ground. The remaining peasants, unable to hear the shots at that distance, scattered in panic, looking around in bewilderment and wondering where the shots were coming from. Fear gripped the village. The families of the dead sobbed wildly and dragged the bodies by their hands and feet toward their houses and barns. Children and older people, unaware of what was happening, milled aimlessly about. After a few moments, everyone disappeared. Even the shutters were closed. Mika examined the village again. There must have been no one left outside, for his inspection took some time. Suddenly he put aside the binoculars and seized the rifle. I wondered, it was perhaps some young man sneaking between the houses, trying to outsmart the sniper and get quickly back to his hut. Not knowing where the bullets came from, he stopped now and then and stared about him. As he reached the row of wild rose bushes, Mika fired again. The man stopped as though nailed to the ground. He bent one knee, tried to bend the other, and then just toppled into the rose bushes. The thorny branches shook uneasily. Mika leaned on his rifle and rested. The peasants were all in their houses, and none dared to come out. How I envied Mika. I suddenly understood a good deal of what one of the soldiers he said in a discussion with him. How I envied Mika. I suddenly understood a good deal of what one of the soldiers had said in a discussion with him. Human being, that's a proud title. Man carries in himself his own private war, which he has to wage, win or lose. Himself, his own justice, which is his alone to administer. Now Mika the cuckoo had meted out revenge for the death of his friends, regardless of the opinions of others, risking his position in the regiment and his title of hero of the Soviet Union. If he could not revenge his friends, what was the use of all those days of training in the sniper's art, the mastery of eye, hand, and breath? Of what value was the rank of hero, respected and worshipped by tens of millions of citizens, if he no longer deserved it in his own eyes? There was another element in Mika's revenge. A man, no matter how popular and admired, lives mainly with himself. If he is not at peace with himself, if he is harassed by something he did not do but should have done to preserve his own image of himself, he is like the unhappy demon, spirit of exile, gliding high above the sinful world. I'm gonna read that. Human being, that's a proud title. I'm gonna highlight this whole thing right here. A man, no matter how popular and admired, lives mainly with himself. If he is not at peace with himself, he is harassed. If he is harassed by something he did not do but should have done to preserve his own image of himself, he is like the unhappy demon spirit of exile, gliding high above the sinful world. I also understood something else. There were many paths and many ascents leading to the summit. But one could also reach the summit alone with the help at most of a single friend, the way Mika and I had climbed the tree. This was a different summit, apart from the march of the working masses. With a kind smile, Mika handed me the binoculars. I peered eagerly at the village, but there was nothing to see except tightly shut houses. Here and there a hen or a turkey strutted. I was just about to hand the glasses back to him when a big dog appeared between the houses. It wagged its tail and scratched its ear with the hind leg. I remembered Judas. He had done just that as he scowled at me hanging on the he had done just that as he scowled at me hanging on the hooks. I touched Micah's arm, pointing to the village with my head. He thought I meant that people were moving, and he concentrated on the telescopic sight. Seeing no one, he looked at me questioningly. I told him in sign language that I wanted him to kill the dog. He showed surprise and refused. I asked him again. He refused, looking at me with disapproval. We sat in silence, listening to the fearful rustle of the forest. Micah surveyed the village again, but there was nothing to see. He folded the tripod and removed the telescopic sight. We started down slowly. Micah sometimes muttered from pain as he hung on his arms, searching for a footing below. He buried the spent cartridges under the moss and removed all traces of our presence. Then we walked toward the camp, where we could hear engines being tested by mechanics. We got back in unnoticed. In the afternoon, when the other men were on duty, Micah quickly cleaned the rifle and the sight and replaced them in their sheaths. That evening he was mild and cheerful as before. In a sentimental voice he sang ballads about Chepayev, about the beauty of Odessa, about gunners who, with 1,000 batteries, were avenging the mothers who had lost their sons in the war. The soldiers sitting near sang the chorus. Their voices carried loud and clear. From the village came the faint, steady tolling of the funeral bells. That sucks.